off with some background information on who we are and how this report came to be. So the report is a collaboration between two research initiatives I run. The first is the UC Collaborative to Promote Immigrant and Student Equity, or UC Promise, which is a multi-campus initiative at the University of California that conducts research with the goal of informing policies and practices that will advance equity and inclusion for undocumented and immigrant origin students. And in 2019, UC Promise received funding from the UC Office of the President to conduct a study of UC students with immigrant parents, really trying to understand the extent to which immigration-related policies produce inequalities in the educational and well-being outcomes of students who are undocumented or members of mixed status families, specifically citizen students with undocumented parents. So our goal was to use this knowledge, right, and this information to really identify ways to better support and promote students' educational success and well-being. And as we were preparing to conduct that survey, our team was really reflecting on the uniqueness of the UC campuses for undocumented students and the need to understand undocumented student experiences beyond the UC. So what we did is reached out to faculty at California State University campuses throughout the state and brought them on as collaborators through the Undocumented Student Equity Project, which is another research effort that I lead. And with their support, we were able to simultaneously field a survey with CSU undocumented students at 9 Cal State campuses. And what has resulted is now one of the largest surveys ever conducted with undocumented students. In total, we surveyed about 1,277 students, split almost equally between the two systems. And we did this online from March to June 2020, so last spring. And the survey is actually really comprehensive in the scope of topics that we talked about, right? Questions covered 3 key outcomes: academic performance and educational experiences, health and well-being, and civic and political engagement. We also asked questions about immigration-related experiences like deportation and financial strain, perceptions of the immigration policy context, institutional context and resource use, and also self and family demographics. And with the onset of COVID, right, which happened several weeks into our survey, we adapted the survey to instruct people to think about what was common before COVID, and also were able to add a few questions about their experiences during the initial months of the pandemic. So in total, it took students about 25 to 35 minutes to complete the survey, and then they received a $10 gift card as compensation for their time. So the report that we're going to talk about today draws on this survey data to provide a comprehensive overview of the state of undocumented students at the UC and Cal State campuses, right, the two public university systems in California. And over the past 2 decades, California has really opened the halls of higher education to undocumented youth. State policies and institutional practices have steadily increased their numbers on our campuses, and California now hosts 1 in 5 of the nation's undocumented college students. And prior research has been mostly based on interviews, which is very important work and is work that's been done by a lot of our collaborators on this project. And these sort of interview-based work has been able to tell us what students experience on the ground, right? It's taught us about the processes through which immigration status raises barriers and how students negotiate them. And that's been really important and useful in understanding student experiences and how we can improve them. But now with this survey data, what we're able to also see is the extent to which these experiences are common. So there's an estimated 4,000 UC undocumented students and 9,500 students at the Cal States, meaning that we've surveyed almost 1 of every 10 undocumented students enrolled in these university systems. In this relative vacuum of institutional data on undocumented students, our study allows us to give one of the strongest assessments available of the state of undocumented students and how they're faring once they arrive to university campuses in California. So that's a little bit about the study, and I'm happy to answer more questions about that as we get to the question and answer portion of the webinar at the end. But for now, I'd like to introduce our panelists, who are 7 of my 21 co-authors on this report. It was a very deep collaborative effort between a lot of faculty on a lot of campuses. But today we have with us Karina Chavarria, who's Assistant Professor of Sociology at CSU Channel Islands, Melissa Hagan, who is Assistant Professor of Psychology at San Francisco State, Jennifer Nahera, who's Associate Professor and Chair of Ethnic Studies at UC Riverside. Annie Rowe, who's Associate Professor of Public Health at UC Irvine. William Rosales, who is Assistant Professor of Sociology at Cal State LA. Heidi Saravia, Associate Professor of Sociology at Sacramento State. And Zulema Valdez, Associate Vice Provost for the Faculty and Professor of Sociology at UC Merced. So let's get started. So the first part of the report examines how undocumented students are faring on key outcomes, specifically educational experiences, health and well-being, and civic and political engagement. So can you all share with us some of the most important findings from those sections?
Thank you, Laura. Yes, welcome everyone. It's great to have you here on, at least in Southern California, a beautiful December sunny morning or afternoon. So in terms of academic performance and educational experiences, we know that those are two key features or aspects that help us understand student success, right? And the survey results reveal to us that undocumented immigration status continues to compromise students' educational experiences. And yet, students still find the wherewithal to maintain their academic performance, which really points to a more nuanced story about undocumented college students' experiences, rather than just either stellar students or students who are struggling to perform academically. For example, in terms of their academic engagement in class and focus on academic work, 76% report being distracted due to issues related to their immigration status, while 64% of them lost needed study hours because they were dealing with or thinking about issues related to their status. Quite critically, undocumented students face limited options to take part in career preparation programming, with only 38% reporting they participated in an internship or career relevant employment. Without adequate opportunities to participate in these career preparation programs, our documented students are really left to unable to reap the fruits of their academic resilience post-graduation, especially as our students surveyed reported 65% of those, right, report a 3.0 GPA or higher. So to strengthen the foundation for student success, campuses can create or expand programming to provide student strategies to help mitigate or manage the disruptions created by their immigration status, and really assist them in remaining focused on their school. So this can take a number of forms, right? And one of these is campuses can establish peer mentoring programs, particularly juniors and seniors, right? Becoming bridges for first-time freshmen or incoming transfer students by sharing the tools for navigating campus resources and support services. Additionally, campuses can also provide wraparound services, right, via cross-campus collaboration teams that includes academic support services, mental health counselors, and undocumented student services. Because we know that undocumented students face not just single issue barriers, but really reflects the intersecting forms of marginalization that compound the struggles they confront, right? And that's really critical. Finally, right, campuses really need to expand professional development programs and internships to ensure that undocumented students, both those with DACA, right, as well as those without employment authorization, have opportunities to prepare for their intended careers, such as, for example, right, via project-based fellowship programs where students can acquire critical career relevant skills and professionalization that is key to their success post-graduation.
Relative to what you had mentioned, Karina, regarding intersecting identities and marginalization, we are very interested in looking at mental health and well-being, which is an increasing concern among educators. Undocumented students show a really interesting mix of increased risk, but also enhanced resilience. So in terms of risk, mental health difficulties among these students are pretty high. We see that almost 1 in 3 scored in clinical ranges on depression and anxiety, and almost a quarter, so 25% of students endorsed having thoughts about hurting themselves or taking their own life in the past 2 weeks. It's particularly troubling. Many of these students recognize that they have a need for mental health support, which is great. Almost 75% of students thought that they could really benefit from emotional support from a professional therapist. However, only half of those who indicated that they could benefit actually sought out that professional support. Before mentioning, some recommendations to address these issues, I think it's important to point out that despite these mental health concerns, or in addition to these mental health concerns, undocumented students exhibit remarkable resilience. For example, they reported high levels of what I call social self-worth, feelings that they matter in their community and that they're worthy of getting their needs met. And they also reported high feelings of self-respect, optimism, purpose, and living a meaningful life at the same level we see in national samples of college students. In terms of recommendations, there is a significant shortage of mental health professionals in academic settings, and particularly mental health professionals who are trained to consider and address the unique needs of undocumented students. So in addition to hiring more mental health professionals, we really need to think about building collaborations between the student services centers that service undocumented students and mental health counseling programs. Counselors should also work with undocumented student services to develop orientations about what counseling is, what services are available, maybe provide drop-in services where the undocumented student services programs are housed. Given that our data also shows that high levels of campus belonging are protective, this would be really important to kind of fold into increasing access and quality of clinical services specifically.
Thanks, Melissa. That's so important and so interesting. And I think, really important for us to think about the ways that campuses can respond to provide the infrastructural support that undocumented students need. In my work with undocumented students, what I've noticed is that, oftentimes they're at the forefront of actually pushing the institution to provide the services that they need. And so I was really interested in the piece here and helped to develop the questions around civic and political engagement. And what we found in the survey was really, I think, reflective of some of the things that I was seeing on the ground at UC Riverside. So, in thinking about civic and political engagement, we think about it in 2 ways. Civic engagement being, volunteering, participating in any kind of organization to solve a social problem. And then on the political engagement side, we see things more like talking to people about voting, expressing political views in different ways. And so what we found through the survey was that undocumented students are actually very engaged in their communities. And the survey results showed us that, they engage at levels that are much higher than the overall population of young people. So for example, in terms of civic engagement, we see 29% of undocumented young people reporting participating in an organization to solve a social problem, compared to 19% of the general population of young people. So that's a 10% difference, which I think is pretty significant. So, that's just trying to make their communities better, right? Addressing, issues that they see in their communities themselves, right? Taking it upon themselves to do something to change their circumstances. And then we see actually the differences between undocumented young people and the general population of young people in political engagement to be much more stark. And so we see, for example, 79% of undocumented young people saying that they talk to people to try to convince them to vote for particular candidates or for political issues. And please, keep in mind that, these are people who cannot vote themselves. And so you think about somebody who, doesn't have voting rights, you think about them as disenfranchised, you think of them as unable to participate in the political process. But actually, what we have been seeing and reflected in the survey is that undocumented young people are finding ways, right? Talking to people, encouraging them, like this policy is going to affect all of us. So, please vote. And so, 79%, that rate of undocumented people talking to others about why they should vote and how they should vote is more than double the general population in the way that they talk to people about voting. So, on a final note, one of the other major things that we found was that in the survey was that UC students were more civically and politically engaged than their Cal State counterparts. So at a range between 9 and 15% more on various issues. And so this is something that we thought, and when I say we in particular, I want to acknowledge my colleague, my colega, William Rosales, who we have really been thinking through these issues of civic and political engagement together, that, anywhere between 9 and 15%, there's a sort of gap between the UC and Cal State engagement, right, in civic and political spheres. And so, as a policy recommendation, we were thinking, that this is something that, should be investigated more fully, on the academic side, but also in terms of the institution, it would be really wonderful for the Cal States to think about ways to increase their civic and political engagement. Because what we really have here is a population of young people who are trying to make their communities better, both in terms of like the social fabric, but also in terms of the political context that's affecting their lives and the lives of their fellow community members.
So thank you, Jennifer and Karina and Melissa for sharing those key findings. I think it's really important to give a sense of where undocumented students are at, right, on these outcomes that we think about a lot as educators and as stakeholders in trying to improve policies for this group of students. And this really helps set the stage for understanding how we can support, right, the holistic development of undocumented students and their success, which is something that we're all very committed to. And the report really also establishes that students who are experiencing, right, these higher levels of various immigration-related strains, right, related to deportation threats or financial strains, have worse outcomes in terms of academic and well-being outcomes, but also higher rates of civic and political engagement. And this is something that really we'll explore in the second part of the report, right, is how common are these immigration-related strains? So maybe William and Zulema, you could share with us a little bit about what some of those key findings are.
Sure. One major concern is the threat of deportation among undocumented students. In terms of immigration policy context, punitive immigration enforcement policies in the recent years have really made this threat of deportation, salient and real, driving feelings of exclusion, isolation, and discrimination among undocumented students. Importantly, undocumented students experience this deportation threat primarily as a threat to their parents. What we found in our survey that 50% of undocumented students reported thinking about their parent guardian's deportation once a week or more, and 38% reported thinking about their own deportation as frequently. Additionally, not only are undocumented students preoccupied with this thought of deportation, but have also had direct experience with deportation and or deportation proceedings. One thing that our study found was that 39% of respondents reported that they, a family member, and or a friend had been involved in a deportation proceeding, detention, or had been deported. Of those, 25 identified as a parent and guardian as having had a direct experience with deportation. Lastly, deportation, affects other factors beyond the actual immigration process, right? Students indicated that they perceive deportation as a threat to their own family stability, with 56% reporting always worrying about family separation due to deportation or the risk of deportation. But beyond deportation, we found that undocumented students experience the existing immigration policy context in other ways, such as with experiences of social isolation and discrimination. Now, with regard to social isolation, undocumented students reported moderate levels of social exclusion due to immigration policy. Specifically, our study found that 58% of respondents reported feelings, at least sometimes, that they have no liberty or need to stay home because of immigration policy. Almost half of the sample reported that they avoided public locations such as parks, neighborhoods, at least sometimes. Reports of immigration-related discrimination were less salient when compared to social isolation. Approximately 1/3 of our sample reported being treated unfairly at restaurants or stores or experiencing immigration-related exploitation at work frequently. Though these reports were fairly low or average, almost 50% of respondents, however, perceive that others believe that they have the right to treat immigrants unfairly or poor at least some of the times. Now, with regard to policy recommendations, one question is, what can higher ed do, right? So we recommend that institutions of higher learning recognize that immigration policy is directly related to the goals and mission of higher education, and importantly, to the success of students. Institutions of higher education should take a more leadership role in advancing more comprehensive immigration policies, such as pushing for a pathway to citizenship. Now, on a more local scale, institutions of higher ed should provide know your rights training for students and their families, right? So kind of expanding the scope. So given the preoccupation with parental deportation and family instability, efforts should be made to empower students and their families so that they not only know their rights under the shifting policy and legal context, but are provided with materials in several languages, and should include items such as family preparedness plans and wallet-sized cards that details one's rights.
And in addition to the very real fear of deportation, almost all undocumented students experience substantial financial strain and economic hardship. For the most part, financial strain for our undocumented students means that they do not have enough money for school-related materials and basic needs, including food. And so these are very real effects on students' ability to perform well academically when they're worried about these kinds of financial hardships. But their worry is also well placed, as 1 out of 3 of these students reported a difficulty paying bills, and 1 out of 5 regularly go without basic items or needed materials. And basic needs aside, more concerning in the report was the number of students who reported food insecurity. To just take a second to define food insecurity, the US Department of Agriculture defines food insecurity as a lack of consistent access to enough food for an active, healthy life. And I want to pause here to just also note that this is a different thing than hunger. So to make the distinction, what food insecurity is related to is a lack of available financial resources for the purchase of food, as opposed to hunger, which is like an individual state of discomfort. It might surprise you to know also that a lot of UC and CSU students struggle with food insecurity, about 40% of the general student population. That said, our report revealed that 60% of undocumented students in the UC and CSU systems face food insecurity, and this is a 20% increase over the student population as a whole. And when we talk about food insecurity, what does that look like? For our undocumented students, this looks like around half of them report some things like eating less than they felt they should, having to skip meals, or even running out of food because of money. And clearly, these financial hardships are associated with basic needs and food insecurity, that these financial hardships are affecting our undocumented students in serious ways. Our report offers a number of recommendations to try to address these concerns. But I just want to mention one that would make an immediate impact in the lives of students, which would be to expand need-based aid that's available to undocumented students, such as emergency grants, and making these readily available to our students with little, need to fill out, substantial forms and things like that. Turning to another factor that affects outcomes, I want to mention briefly our findings on campus climate. In here, there's some good news and maybe some less good news that we can kind of work on as a group that's committed, right, to undocumented student success. So on the one hand, undocumented students struggle to access needed campus information, resources, and services. Around 1/4 of students with DACA and 1/3 of students with no legal status have reported being denied access to campus resources due to their immigration status. Even more students report having to educate staff or faculty about their eligibility for a resource or service, or when seeking services, they can receive inaccurate information. The difficulty undocumented students experience in seeking timely and accurate information, resources, and services is stressful and time-consuming. And I want to also note that these feelings of having to go from one place to the other can affect a student's sense of belonging on the campus, since this is critical information that they need, that the university requires of them, and then it's difficult for them, and it can seem very out of reach for this particular population. On the other hand, there's some good news to report on campus climate, particularly when we think about undocumented students' day-to-day life. On the whole, undocumented students are suggesting that the campus climate can be characterized as pro-immigrant. And the pro-immigrant sentiment that they report on campus is actually a really nice and heartening thing that they're reporting. It is up to 3/4 of our students have regularly heard faculty, staff, and students express positive feelings about undocumented immigrant communities. And on perhaps the negative, only about 1 in 10 undocumented students had reported hearing negative expressions or feelings expressed from faculty and staff. So although there are some caveats, and especially with respect to providing the information and resources and services students need, the students on the campus as a whole are reporting that the space is supportive. The only policy recommendation I want to kind of highlight here, as my time is running out, is just to say that the students would benefit tremendously from professional development training for staff who are regularly providing this kind of information to our undocumented students.
Thank you both for sharing sort of those key findings. I think it's really important to, thinking about these, really important to think about a sense of how undocumented students are experiencing immigration policies, right? And recognizing that there is not a sort of homogeneous way in which they are experiencing their status on a daily basis, and sort of recognizing that there is that variation in experience. And I think also thinking about campus, right, and institutions, and what can be done at the institutional level and what's being already done at the institutional level. So getting a sense of, which is really what the third part of the report does, is looks at institutional support for students, both in terms of campus-wide resources, but also undocumented student services. So Hailey, can you give us a sense of some of those important findings from that section?
Yes, thank you, Laura. We found that undocumented students overwhelmingly use undocumented student research services. 3 out of 4 students reported having been to an office or met with a person that focuses on supporting undocumented students on their campus. Of these, 82% had met with a professional staff member, and about 2 out of every 5 students who reported using these services had done so once a month or more. However, we also found that 1 out of 4 students in the survey felt that their immigration status prevents them from accessing the resources they need on campus. They also reported they also reported using campus-wide services less frequently than undocumented student services. The one exception was the basic needs and food pantry, which was the most frequently used campus-wide service. In fact, 53% of respondents used this resource, with the majority of students visiting once a month or more, and a third of students visiting at least once a week. Importantly, undocumented student services are key bridges to campus-wide resources. For example, 8 out of 10 students who had used undocumented student services reported being referred to another person on campus who could provide support, services, or resources. And so based on these findings, we had several recommendations, and I will highlight 2 key recommendations here. First, universities need to increase funding and support for undocumented student services. These are being used at high rates and merit additional investment. Additionally, funds should be directed to key services that address vulnerabilities prevalent in this student population, like the basic needs and food pantry. Second, universities should strengthen collaborations between undocumented student services and key campus services. Efforts to support undocumented students should not reside solely with undocumented student services. Training a key person within various resource offices will facilitate additional referrals between campus-wide resources and undocumented student services. These point people can also collaborate with undocumented student services to develop relevant programming. When advancing these efforts, care should be taken to ensure that offices work together as partners, rather than placing the burden solely on undocumented student services. Working with a holistic approach, especially during these times of pandemic crisis, will ensure universities are better prepared to provide support, services, and resources to undocumented and documented students.
Thanks, Haley. I think, right, it's important to think about our current context, right, and trying to serve students in our virtual world of pandemic life. And I think that's unfortunately something that we don't address in the report, but is something that we are addressing in additional briefs that will follow soon. So Annie, can you give us a sense of sort of some of the key findings from the briefings that will come shortly after this?
Sure. So one of the briefings that we're working on has to do with how are students affected by and dealing with the COVID pandemic. And so we were in an interesting position timing wise, because as soon as the survey went out, the COVID pandemic happened literally weeks afterwards. And so Laura and the research team, kind of overnight, we made the decision to add items about how students were affected by the ongoing pandemic. And we asked about 6 areas: their finances, their family's finances, their mental health and physical health, their attention to academics, and their academic performance. And it was actually really great that we added these, because this is something that hasn't been looked at not only in this population, but just generally. And we found that students were absolutely overwhelmingly negatively affected by the COVID pandemic, with the exception of physical health. In all other areas, 90% of the students in the survey said that they were negatively affected in some way by COVID. In physical health, it was high. It wasn't 90%, but it was something like 80%. And so for those of us who are living through and have lived through the COVID pandemic, it's not surprising to see how disruptive it was, but it is really striking to see it quantified in that way and to see the levels of negative impact that high. And when we're looking at the areas that seem to be most affected, there were 2. It was attention to academics and family finances. So over 1 in 3 of the students in the survey said that COVID negatively affected them a great deal in this area. So a great deal was sort of the most extreme response that they could have selected. So when we're thinking about policy recommendations that have to do with negative outcomes from COVID, there are a few. And they're especially pressing, right, because we're right in the middle of the pandemic. But the first has to do with how educational institutions can buffer some of the financial strain. So the UC and the CSU systems were real trailblazers early on, and that they offered emergency grants to undocumented students who were quite deliberately left out of a lot of the federal funding for COVID. And so as talks for new federal stimulus funding are in the works, and this is certainly something that institutions can be and should be, we hope, reconsidering. And the second policy recommendation has to do with identifying who's at high risk and really targeting the available campus resources there. We found that students who had high levels of campus resource use prior to the pandemic actually reported being more negatively affected. And so these are campus resources like the food pantry, academic services, student health clinics. And so as these resources are probably not operating at 100% of their services, given campus closures and remote learning, it's really important to make sure that the services they are being offered are especially being targeted at those who were high users, because it does seem like they're the ones with the most need.
Great, thank you, Annie. So that sort of the brief overview of the research report. Hopefully you heard some new, interesting, and important findings. So now we have plenty of time for Q&A. If you want to drop your questions in the Q&A, which some folks have been doing, and we'll answer some of those live. So go ahead and add things, and we'll answer them as we get to them. I think I'm going to start with this first question here. So how has access, so actually let's start with the differences between UCs and CSUs and start with that broader question, and then we'll circle back to that first part. Does anybody want to take that?
I can take that on. That's a great question. And we saw some interesting differences, but maybe not as many as you might expect. In terms of demographics or general characteristics, we saw that CSU students were more than twice as likely to work close to full time, and 4 times as many CSU students reported living at home with family compared to UC students. And so perhaps as a result, as I believe William discussed, CSU students report thinking about their parents' deportation more frequently than UC students. I think the biggest or most complex area in which we saw differences was in terms of financial status. So on the one hand, financial insecurity seemed to be significantly higher among CSU students. So a greater proportion of CSU students reported concerns about not being able to finance their education, worrying about not having enough money to pay for things or pay their bills, or worrying about having to actually take time off of school, as well as actually going without materials needed for their studies. That difference might be surprising given the lower cost of the CSU, but we know that the UC system offers substantial aid packages that might buffer some of the higher costs. In contrast to financial insecurity, students at UCs reported significantly higher food insecurity compared to CSU students. So 42% of UC students, as opposed to about 1/3 of CSU students, were identified as having very low food security. So it's not a matter of saying, UC students are more well off than CSU students. It's a complex picture. Those are some of the main differences.
If I could add just a bit to that, sorry to jump in, but I wanted to also add another difference, which we can think about why this might be, and we probably need to do a little bit more about this, is that the campus climate in the sense of belonging was higher among our CSU students than they were from the UC students. And that was about, anywhere from 5 to 10% differences. So although the climate overall is a positive story in terms of social interaction and feelings of belonging, the CSU students are reporting greater social cohesion and integration than our UC counterparts.
Well, this is so interesting because when I think about, the differences that we found in terms of civic and political engagement, I think what both Melissa and Sulema are saying makes a lot of sense. If indeed, Cal State students are working more than UC students, then they might not have the actual time to be participating in organizations, to be engaging politically. And the other relationship that we found, to Sulema's point, was that students were actually more likely to be civically and politically engaged if they felt less comfortable on their campuses. So if they experienced negative campus climate, they were more likely to be involved than if they experienced positive campus climate. And so, we see in terms of these differences between the Cal States and the UCs and students, undocumented students, civic and political engagement, it makes a lot of sense what the two of you are saying.
Great. Anybody want to add more about campus differences or similarities? No? Okay. So I think, I'm looking at the questions. Anybody see a question that they want to answer? I think maybe one thing to think about, it's sort of a broader, similarly broad question, is differences between students that have DACA and those who don't, right, who are have no current legal status. Does anybody want to share some of the findings we found around differences between those two groups? Anybody?
I can jump in.
Okay.
So one of the things that, and again, this is probably not a surprise and probably makes sense if you think about it, that with respect to financial strain, undocumented students, all undocumented students are experiencing hardships. First, I think we have to really just acknowledge that. The students with DACA may be, a slightly more have slightly more economic certainty because they have the status that allows them to have a job, for example, right? And that makes the difference. But I think that overall, what we're finding is that the undocumented students are a population that do have great economic and financial need. It's very difficult to separate that out from what their family experiences. And so those things are connected. And in fact, something to think about, right, is how a student is not an individual student, they're part of a family. And if they're part of a mixed status family or an undocumented student is part of a larger undocumented student family, then those economic hardships are still there. And so the differences are modest in terms of that. And that's what I would want to underscore in terms of kind of financial, and it's the same, slightly again, the same with the climate, the campus climate, in the sense of belonging. There's it's probably like a 5 to 10% difference between students with DACA and then students with no legal status in terms of feeling like they're comfortable and like they have a sense of belonging on the campus. So we're kind of seeing those differences kind of play out in ways that we might expect.
And I think there's also differences, right, in ways that there's not differences in ways that we don't expect, right? So in terms of mental health, right, that there is no differences in their rates of anxiety and depression symptoms, right, where we might expect DACA to be protective, it ends up not being, likely because if we think about the context in which we're asking these questions, right, these were the months leading up to the Supreme Court decision around DACA, right? So in some ways it provides protection, but in other ways it doesn't always, right, because of its liminal status. Gadina, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, there's a number of questions regarding the kinds of resources that were denied to students, right? And a couple of questions around undocumented graduate students. Our survey didn't include graduate students, but we know that once they complete their baccalaureate, right, their BA degrees, the types of financial aid available for graduate school for undocumented students students really plummets. And in particular programs like professionalization of professional programs like law, school of education, master's programs, there are very limited sources of financial aid that are not loans, right? And so what we can say based on the reports of the students we did survey is that some of the issues that undocumented students confront at our UCs and CSU campuses is that, one, oftentimes they are given erroneous information. They are told, oh, you don't qualify for this because the particular staff personnel are not trained sufficiently to understand the intricacies of changes, particularly in California, the shifting policy with a DREAM Act and a number of other policies that were implemented to expand access for AB 540 students, right? And so they encounter those kinds of barriers in terms of not having access to what resources they're entitled to, financial aid, support from academic counselors, right? Accessing programs targeted for undocumented students. And so our students reported to us that they were either told, no, you don't qualify, were given the wrong documents to fill out, had to go back and forth between offices a number of times, and oftentimes just gave up because it was way too hard to actually access the support they were looking for. And so that tells us, right, that there's a more extensive need to really do some in-depth training of personnel, oftentimes personnel that might not actually see undocumented students very often, but everybody at our institution should be aware, right, of the various support services, in particular, the legislative changes and policies that have been implemented to ensure that what these policies intended actually is realized at our institutions. I also want to add, for a number of questions here, right? We included at the end, right, after we came back to virtual teaching in the spring semester, we included a number of questions regarding COVID. And our students had an opportunity to express, right, the kind of impact that COVID was having on them and their families. And as Sulema stated, right, the impact is one at the family unit level, right, because they were asked to leave campuses to go back home, right. We are seeing the detrimental consequences of COVID because they lost jobs, right? Their financial stability is jeopardized because parents lost either the job or lost significant hours of work. They have become the sole providers of the family now, right? And so you have this compounding effect that then we see in the kind of stress and anxiety, right? And mental health debilitation that's happening with students because now they're taking on these other psychological and emotional strains of having to care for younger siblings, their parents, and having to deal with living conditions that are not conducive to their academic success and being able to just focus on their schooling.
Thanks, Karina. I think there's several questions here that kind of get at issues of implementation, right? How do we implement the recommendations, right? I would say, half the report feels like recommendations of policies and practices that we can make. So what are some of the ways that you see that sort of next steps being now that the data is out there?
So I can take a first stab at this, right? So one of the goals of this project has been to really engage with a number of stakeholders, right? Both within the academic institutions, but also more broadly in the community and political representatives, right? And so one of the ways in which we are devising tools to disseminate this information to our respective stakeholders at our institutions is by directly establishing, if they haven't been already, links and channels with our deans, our provost, our university presidents, and really create, right, and establish workshops where we can discuss the findings and begin to outline, right, practices and ways in which we can improve already established programs and services, but also where we need to really clearly extend or create new opportunities for our students to strengthen the institution's ability to mediate the impacts of immigration status, particularly within the COVID pandemic context, right? And so, for example, right, creating these cross-campus institutional teams, right, between undocumented student service centers, the academic dean's offices, student services representatives, particularly the presidents or directors of these centers, right, and really comprehensively work as a team, create teams that will sit together and look at the experiences of students at those institutions and develop strategic and targeted programming for them. And given that we're in a virtual environment, right, how do we do that online, right? And because our students are spread out across, for many of us at the CSUs, across various counties, really connecting with services organizations where they live, so that if we are unable to, because of the virtual environment, we can have a direct referral, right, to these service providers who you know are vetted and are trusted in the communities.
Okay, I thought I saw somebody going to say something. Okay, I think a similar sort of question is sort of recommendations for sort of student affairs professionals who are not in undocumented student services, right? Who might be working in sort of basic needs, food pantries, or other kinds of places that are seeing high numbers of undocumented students. Any recommendations for those particular student affairs professionals?
We've had a lot of conversations about student affairs and really the tremendous impact that student affairs can have on our undocumented students. I think that, you know, and this is sort of coming back around to the idea of information and misinformation and resource use. But I mean, at a bare minimum, I think that, you know, the student affairs should have like a fully trained financial aid office, right? So that they know that, you know, that they're keeping abreast of the policies that are changing, that are helping undocumented students. Say, I mean, now these policies aren't so new anymore, but, you know, you have AB 540 and you have the California DREAM Act, which really is, you know, instrumental for our students to be able to access financial aid and just to be able to continue with their studies. And it's surprising, you know, that not all financial aid officers at all of the campuses are trained in these policies. So it would be, I think, at a very base level of utmost importance for financial aid officers to be trained as to these policies. And the other piece is counseling and psychological services. And it's delicate because, you know, as we know, you know, there are people who hold very anti-immigrant attitudes, and, you know, they might feel some resistance to helping an undocumented student. But what we're not asking for them to become allies. You know, the ask isn't, you know, for student affairs, you know, to say, hey, our counseling and psychological services need to be allies. It's not about that. It's about being trained in the particular psychological needs of undocumented students, similar to, you know, the way that they might be trained to help and to talk to you know, any type of student, any cross section of the student population that has a particular background, right? So I think those are two offices that are really important, you know, in terms of student affairs. And then also, I mean, I think, you know, what happens is that our undocumented student services centers, the dream centers, are so overburdened, because they get referred for everything. Financial aid will send students to undocumented student programs. And so the idea would be that there, I think, should be partnerships between the Undocumented Student Program Center and financial aid and counseling and psychological services. And at UCR, we have a really wonderful collaboration with the Career Center to really try to address the needs of undocumented students, as they near graduation. What does it look like to be undocumented, either with DACA or without DACA on the job market? And so those are collaborations, I think, that can happen that don't take a huge amount of money. They don't take a huge amount of financial investment in terms of the university, but can have a really deep impact on student experience and student success, right?
I'm wondering if anybody can talk also about maybe career counseling or the Career Center and recommendations for how that particular space may be able to better serve undocumented students.
Just really quickly, wanted to add to sort of Jennifer's conversation that in terms of access to resources on campus, we saw that students expressed mental health issues, but were not accessing mental health services. They were expressing anxiety about plans after graduation, but they were not accessing the Career Center. And so one of the recommendation is that you begin with one point person who will be trained on the issues that undocumented and documented students must deal with, so that if somebody comes, you at least have one person that has the expertise to provide accurate information. And then you train, and then you train more staff, because I think one of the problems is that if you continue to send every student back to the undocumented service program, then they get overburdened. So I will say that one of the recommendations will be to begin with one point person and then expand. In terms of career, specific to the Career Center, I really like that idea that Jennifer was referring to, right? Best practices, other programs that really target again, the specific needs, the specific experiences of undocumented and documented students, so that they can provide programming that addresses these particular issues.
Thanks. I think we're coming up at the end. So I think we definitely did get to answer all the questions. I know there are a lot of questions. I think a lot of the questions are also, why didn't you do this too? And I think I'll just sort of say broadly, we had to make choices. We had to scale down, right? And I think that we did the best we could with what we had. We wanted to make sure that we were not overcommitting, right? Which is why we didn't try and do all Cal State campuses. We wanted to make sure that we had partners on our campuses, right? That would be able to make sure that undocumented students felt comfortable taking our survey, right? That we would be able to reach out through undocumented student services, that we would have relationships to make sure that the data is actionable on the campuses specifically where the data was collected, but also then thinking about beyond campuses, right? So really wanting to make sure that we had people on the ground, that we weren't extending beyond our capacities, and that we could do good work, right? That was faithful to the experience of the undocumented students that we are trying to serve. And I think it's important to put this in a broader perspective, right? We're coming up on the 20th anniversary of AB 540, right? So we've been at this for nearly 20 years trying to create equity and inclusion for undocumented students. And there's clearly more to do, right? And I think I'm hoping, right? We hope that this report gives you some energy, right, to begin doing that work, right? Some information to help frame the work that needs to be done, the asks that need to be made on campuses. It helps you direct your energy in ways where we know that there can be impact. And hopefully it gives you some ideas, right, a roadmap for the next 20 years as we continue to do this work in the ways that we have been doing it for a long time already, and continue to follow in the footsteps of the people that came before us. So hopefully the report helps with that. We will be circulating the report, which is available now on our website. And the webinar will be there as well. We hope that you share it with your friends, share it with your colleagues, share it with people at your campus and beyond, or in the community as well, so that we can, sort of use this to actually create systematic and systemic change in higher education. So on behalf of UC Promise and the USEP team and all of us here, thank you for joining us, and happy reading.